welcome again to our exploration of upcoming Sunday weekend, scriptures this week. The first reading comes from the book of Job, from the 7th chapter, and includes verses 1 through 4 and 6 through 7. So a little bit of that. Perhaps at the end we'll explore that a little bit. Again, another reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, this time chapter 9, verses 16 through 19, and then 22 and 23. And finally, the Gospel, still from Mark, still in chapter 1. This time we're looking at verses 24 through 39. Now you will remember so far, and as Mark presents his story, chapter 1 really presents the first day, thus far, of Jesus' teaching. And as we saw last time, he was in the synagogue on the Sabbath, that he had been teaching, and that he had cured a demoniac, a man considered to be possessed by the demon, and had cast that out. Today, moving along, we now find Jesus and we assume the 4 other disciples coming to Peter's house, where they encounter Peter's mother-in-law, who is ill, and they tell him about that. He goes in, speaks with her, lifts her up or raises her up. She is, the fever leaves her, and she, as the text then says, proceeds to wait on them. Now, this is kind of an interesting continuation. We have seen Jesus as a teacher. We have seen him as being able to drive out forces that are not good. And now we find Jesus as a healer. So there is a difference between expulsion of forces that are not good in a person's life and healing. Healing generally has to do with some physical disability, and we will see throughout Mark's story a number of times when Jesus does this. In fact, this is the first of a series of healing stories that Mark records. Here, the healing, of course, is the fever. We're not sure just how serious that fever was, but it certainly was enough that it disabled his mother-in-law from being able to do the ordinary things of hospitality. And that may lie behind what this cure is all about, or why it takes place. Remember that now Jesus, having spent the day teaching in the synagogue and others kind of coming to him, now comes to the home of, one assumes that this is Peter's home, or Simon at this point, as he is still called. And there are, of course, a number of quips as to why exactly the healing takes place. First of all, Simon's mother-in-law is not named, and we're not quite sure just the status of Peter, whether he does have a wife, although that most likely is still the case. Hospitality meant that when you invited someone into your home, you were able to provide them, and of course the basicness would be protection, but also food, be able to offer them a meal. And that's what the household of Peter is not able to do. So when she is now restored to health, and she goes and prepares a meal for them, the quality of hospitality, which is very important, by the way, in the ancient world, is fulfilled. Now, that's one way of looking at this particular story. Another way to look at it, and perhaps this is an interesting one, important one, is that this is the first time that Jesus will be healing a woman. And although she is unnamed, we know who she is by relationship, but not by name, there will be a number of other accounts that Mark will tell us of women, often unnamed, who are restored to health. And it's interesting that when Jesus now notices, it's an interesting phrase that Mark uses here, raises her up, touches her. Now, as you will remember, this is against the customs of the time, because to touch someone who has an illness, now obviously if you were blind, that would not be the case, but if you were touching someone who had a illness that was perceived to be contagious, you put yourself in a difficult position. Because if you therefore were to contract it, I suppose the COVID situation of our own time has some similarities with the customs that were prevalent in the first century world. But by Jesus raising her up, touching her, he becomes technically ritually impure. Now, that doesn't mean that he caught the disease. It doesn't mean that it was contagious in the sense of physicalness, but there was a custom that said if you touch someone who is ill, then you become literally impure ritually, not necessarily physically. But Jesus breaks that custom. He lifts her up, he raises her, and others point out that the term raising her up is the term that Mark later on at the end of his story uses when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, that God raises him up. So there is, remember, this is the first chapter of Mark's story, and in some ways there's a bookending going on. What is important in the first chapter becomes also rather important in the last chapter of Mark's work. So the uncleanness of Jesus, therefore, not to be reiterated too many times, is that he finds himself ritually impure. The mother-in-law begins to serve them, as I said, provides hospitality, and that's important. But what is also important here, as many have pointed out, that she serves Jesus and his companions. Remembering that later on, as this gospel unfolds, Jesus will make the remark that I came not to be served, but to serve. And so in a certain way, she carries out what indeed is important. Now, keep in mind what's gone on so far in this brief story that Jesus has been chosen by God to be the Messiah, to be the Christ, and calls disciples rather to be with him. But she is the first really to carry out the mission of the kingdom, to serve others, to put her need set aside her need for the sake of others. And also, as we listen to this gospel, we will find that there are other women who are part of the entourage of Jesus. They're not as prevalent in this gospel as they will be in the third gospel, that of Luke, but nevertheless they are present. Somehow, as the men are more obviously part of the story, they are present there. And so Jesus' concern for women is indeed brought out in this gospel in many ways. Now, we will see as we go on through the year that he will cure Jairus' daughter, who is unnamed, but nevertheless, that there's a woman with hemorrhage who he cures, again unnamed. So it's interesting that the women tend not to be named in the gospel, but nevertheless are the recipients of Jesus' healing, and in many ways carry out the role of telling the story of the gospel to others. Now, this pattern of Jesus performing miracles, maybe it's an opportunity here to stop a moment, because in this gospel there are a number of what we would call action stories or miracle stories. Not a lot of teaching, as we've mentioned earlier on, are to be actually found in this gospel, but Jesus is always on the move. And if you read this gospel, and then, immediately, so there's a sense of urgency that also is found in Mark's work, which you notice if you read the whole work or tend to read large sections of it at once, which you don't get too much with the chopping up that we do each week for our Sunday celebrations. But there's a certain pattern that has been noticed in how these miracle stories, which, by the way, the word miracle is not used in the synoptics. They are called acts of power. So in certain ways, what Jesus does shows God at work. I also, now be careful here, but point out that because Jesus is able to do these acts of power does not necessarily emphasize his divinity. Sometimes interpreters have kind of played that point up. There were many other figures in the Old Testament who also performed acts of power or miracles who in no way were divine. So the emphasis here is not on the divinity of Jesus, but rather on the healing aspect of Jesus, and something which he often plays down. He does not like people who are cured to be running out and telling others, because Mark wants to point out that Jesus' mission is not centrally to be a healer, but to be a teacher and a proclaimer or a preacher of the kingdom of God. So what is this pattern that is used when miracles, let's call them that because that's the way we tend to list them in our tradition, has a kind of 6 stages that happen. And you can follow this if you look at the various ways in which these healing stories emerge in Mark's story. First of all, there's the arrival of the miracle worker. So notice Jesus comes to the house of Simon Peter. Secondly, that there's a description of the illness or problem. So his mother-in-law has a fever. There's a request for healing, which is either implicit or explicit. Here, well, it's kind of implicit. She's got this problem, and you can see that Simon is looking around and wondering how supper's going to be made here. We don't know, but I mean, fourthly, there's the healing action. So as we hear, Jesus lifts her up and she is healed. Fifthly is the efficacy of this deed. Well, the healing takes place, and she is now able to get up and carry on with the ordinary activity of her life. And the last section, the 6th section of these miracle stories, is generally some kind of acclamation on the part of the community. And the word that, again, Mark very often likes is they were amazed. If you had to count the number of times in which Jesus is doing amazing things or awesome things, that's a kind of favorite word that Mark likes. So there is this pattern, therefore, that we find being used in the Gospel of Mark, but it also, you will find, carries over into the other synoptics. Not so much in John, but certainly in Matthew and Luke. So all of that is to point out, I think, the importance of women in the entourage of Jesus. They will, in fact, be present at times in which the men, who seem sometimes in this gospel And again, I will pause here a moment because it is a characteristic, I mentioned it last time, but a characteristic of this gospel where those who you would suspect should know and understand what Jesus is doing don't. And those who you suspect should not be able to get who Jesus is and even what he is all about. In this gospel tradition, women tend to, although they're not up front in their presence, tend to be present and tend to understand what Jesus' mission is all about. They become kind of the back part of support for Jesus and for the disciples. Now, this is followed after the kind of little episode, the rest of this, the verses that we're looking at, is that at sundown, now remember that Jesus had been teaching on the Sabbath, and so therefore technically should not be doing any work on the Sabbath, so that at sundown, that would be the end of the Sabbath, a large number of people from the area came to Jesus' house or to the place where he was. And there is some curing also then that goes on. This is followed, so that's day one. A lot has happened on day one in Mark's story. If you kind of go back and look at it, it's all in the first chapter, and we're still not finished with the verses here. Now, very early the next morning before dawn, it's interesting technological use here in which there is a duplicate temporal expression. How's that for kind of big words? Where very early the next morning, okay, and then before dawn. So what does very early mean, but before dawn? So you see, again, just to kind of look at a little bit the literariness of Mark's story, has some of, this is another one of the little characteristics. Double kind of re-emphasizing, and remember, since this basically was an oral gospel, it is important to kind of find ways to say the same thing, but to say it a little differently. So this is an example. Very early in the morning, therefore, before dawn, Jesus gets up and he goes to a deserted place. Now, where is that? Well, it could physically be a desert, that is, not the Gobi Desert, but I mean a dry place. Or it could be a deserted place, simply meaning that there weren't people there, that Jesus went alone in order to pray. Now, in this gospel, there's not a great deal of emphasis on Jesus praying, but it does occur occasionally, and that's important to notice, often praying before important actions take place in Jesus' ministry. Well, as he's there, the disciples, namely Peter, kind of come out to him. They're saying, well, everyone is looking for you. And remember, he had been doing healing before, and one suspects that they wanted to also be healed. Peter kind of says to Jesus, you know, they're looking for you, and he pictured as urging Jesus now to come back and to continue the good work, whereas Jesus now corrects Peter or Simon and says, there are other things now that we need to do. We need to bring the message of the kingdom, message of God, to other towns and villages in the Galilee. And so that ends the section that we're looking at for this week with that idea. He's inviting now the other four to come with him as they begin to share beyond Capernaum. Remember, this is the setting where this takes place, to other places in the Galilee. There's also a quality here that we might look at. which many have noticed with regard to the Gospel of Mark, called the secrecy aspect. That very often Jesus will tell people, don't say anything about what I am doing. And of course, as I mentioned, the best way rather to get something out is to tell people not to do it, right? But throughout this gospel, there's this sense of who Jesus really is, and the mission that he is carrying out is to be kept secret. Now, keep in mind that you and I, as reading the gospel, know immediately who Jesus is. But the audience, that's us, know who Jesus is. But the characters within do not. And one of the characteristics that will be developed quite regularly is the slowest group to catch what Jesus is all about, to understand what his mission is, turns out to be the disciples. So in a certain way, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, women do get a sense of what Jesus is about. The apostles, and that's why Jesus often will stop and say, let me explain this to you. It's as if you didn't get it, now I will explain this to you. So that's what is known as the motif of secrecy, and we will see it as the gospel plays out. So all of those are some things to notice in the gospel of text that we have this week. Now, the first reading, I'm not quite sure just exactly I will share with you what the message of the first reading is, but I'm not quite sure exactly how it relates to what is told in the gospel that we have looked at. But this is the book of Job. Now, I'm sure many of you have, of course, heard of Job. It is perhaps one of the classic, those of you who are familiar with it, one of the classic works of the Old Testament. In fact, it is perhaps one of the finest works in Hebrew, a language that is a part of the Old Testament tradition. It's generally categorized with what is known as the wisdom tradition. And that makes it a little later, closer to Jesus' time. I say later work in the Old Testament, but closer to Jesus' time. So therefore, I don't know if that's later or closer. It's an interesting work. I'm sure that some of you watching probably have heard the adage, the patience of Job. And it's built around a prose story that pictures a man named Job having pretty much enjoying all of the good things of life. And it pictures God in his heavens. This is how the book starts. Dining with the denizens or the citizens of heaven. And along comes the man who is in charge of looking at how things are going on earth. And this man, by the way, is named Satan. Now, it's important to see here that Satan is in the employ of God. And it's his job, as I said, to check out how things are going on earth. Well, he comes back with his report to God, and God says, and by the way, did you notice down there my servant Job, how really good and loyal and faithful he is? And Satan, now the tester, this is his job a little bit, says, well, sure, God, when you got everything, you got lots of money, you got lots of good health, you got lots of family, you got everything you need, of course they're loyal to you. And then God, and this is what's important here, sets up a test. It isn't Satan who tests, but it's God. Go ahead. You can do anything you want to my servant Job except touch his body, and I bet you, it's a kind of heavenly bet here, that only we, the listener to the story, know what's going on. You can do anything you want to Job, and he will remain loyal. Well, That's exactly what happens then as this unfolds. It's almost like a play. There is Job sitting with his at dinner. In comes servant who says, you know, you had a lot of cattle, you lost those. I won't go into all of this. You had a lot of sheep, you lost all of those. You had a lot of camels, you lost all those. That's like being a millionaire and losing everything. And you had a wonderful family, 7 sons, and they were all having dinner together in a house, and the roof fell in, and they're all dead. And Job says, the Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it certainly proves the loyalty. And Satan is back to God and says, you see, you lost. Or God says, you see, I won. And he says, yeah, but you haven't touched his body. And God says, all right, now you can do anything you want to Job, but you can't take his life. And so now we next find Job covered with sores, sitting in the noonday sun on a heap of dung, D-U-N-G. Well, now, if you know what that is, you can see it's a little bit odoriferous to be sitting in the noonday sun. And his wife comes and says, Job, what'd you do to deserve this? And Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And the loyalty of Job is proved by this prose. But what follows from the rest of the book, it's a very long book beginning in chapter 3, is Job begins to question what the heck this is all about. And in fact, if you read in chapter 3 of the prose of Job, poetry of Job, he says, cursed be the day that they said it's a boy. Cursed be the day that they said you have an heir. I wish I never had been born. So, there is Job. Now, Job is the essence of the book, and which takes up a considerable amount of this story, are 3 friends who come to console Job: Elpazar, Bildad, and Zophar. Now, just to kind of bring it to where we are this week, we move to chapter 7, where Zophar, Elpazar rather, has said to Job, you know, Job, and the whole gist of the book is, if Job admits that he has done something wrong, then it makes sense. Good is rewarded, bad is punished. He's done something wrong. He's suffering all these things because he deserves it. And Job will continually say, there are 9 speeches that go on for Job throughout this book. He continually says, look, I'm innocent. But here's the section that is chosen for us to consider this weekend. Job says, is not man's life on earth a drudgery? Are not his days those of hiring? He is a slave that longs for the shade, a hireling who waits for his wages. So I have been assigned months of misery. Troubled nights have been allotted to me. If I'm in bed, I say, when shall I rise? And then the night drags on. I am filled with restlessness until the dawn. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. They come to an end without hope. Remember that my life is like the wind, and I shall not see happiness again. Wow, it certainly sounds like the way in which many people may find when things aren't going so well. And as I say, I'm not quite sure why that's offered for our consideration. Certainly Jesus brings a healing into his ministry, and maybe that's things. But and interestingly, this patient Job is not very patient. In fact, he continually, and as the book concludes, he in fact at one point says to God, you know, God, I am innocent, and I want to know, you should tell me why I am suffering this. And then in the chapters 38 through 42 are great speeches by God to Job. He comes down, he does what Job wants, and Job in the end says, well, I know you're wonderful, God, and all I can do is bow down before you. So that's a quick summary of a very important book, but a little bit of an interpretation that I think the words that are offered for our consideration, sometimes we feel like that. Is God really on our side? The truth of the matter is, that God cares, that God concerns, and that through his Son, Jesus, he brings to us whenever and wherever we are gathered together, particularly when we gather at the table of the Lord, his healing strengths and gifts. So thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.